Well, today's reading includes a number of Jesus' miracles, the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus and Peter very briefly walking on water, the healing of the man born blind, as well as Jesus' transfiguration before Peter, James, and John, and Peter's confession of faith when he recognized Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God. Now, before we consider these events, and especially the subject of miracles, let's back up a moment and recall two pictures we've seen before: Rembrandt's Jacob wrestling with the angel and the return of the prodigal son. We saw this one briefly last week, and this one we spent some time on. Both are images of people who have tried to make it on their own and were actually quite proud to do so. Jacob, on the left, connived and deceived and worked extremely hard to get what he wanted and kept God always at arm's length, in spite of God's periodic appearances in his life. The prodigal son rejected his father, who is an image, if you will, of God the Heavenly Father. He demanded his inheritance and proceeded to live the high and self-centered life. Both men continued this way until a moment of reckoning came. For Jacob, it was on the night before he returned to his homeland and had to face his brother Esau, whom he had defrauded repeatedly in the past and whom he feared would come against him with murder on his mind. For the prodigal, it meant falling into absolute penury, being reduced to tending pigs in a far country and wanting to eat their food, in fact, hitting rock bottom. And then both men had a transforming experience of God. Jacob wrestles with the angel of the Lord throughout the night. It's the culmination of a lifetime of fights and flights from God. And at last he's wounded by God in such a way that the death grip in which he has been locked with God becomes, as you see, an embrace. In this moment, he is fundamentally changed. He becomes, if you will, more truly his real and best self as he unites with God and receives a new name, a new identity in the process. Jacob, the deceiver or supplanter, becomes Israel, he who wrestles with God and prevails. As for the prodigal, the scripture says that when he could fall no further, he came to himself, quite literally, his real and best self, and began the journey back to the Father whose love had always been there before, the Father whose arms open wide to receive him without any recrimination, but whose love the prodigal only now can fully appreciate. The story, in a sense, repeats itself in the tale of Peter's confession of Christ that we read about today. I prefer to take the longer account of this exchange, which occurs in Matthew 16, as opposed to the one our author referred you to in Luke 9. Jesus has taken his disciples aside after they have seen the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. They've had a time of prayer, and then Jesus asks them, "Who do the crowd say that I am?" And they tell him what they've been hearing. Well, some say that you're John the Baptist. Some say that you're Elijah, come back from the dead. And others say that you're one of the prophets of old who has returned. But then Jesus presses them a little bit further. But what about you? Who do you say that I am? And that's always the question, isn't it? It always comes back to that. In our own hearts, who do we say Jesus is? Peter has a moment of complete clarity, and he spontaneously answers, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, Peter still has a long way to go in his walk of faith. just as Jacob and the prodigal did. But he's made a critical breakthrough. He's had this moment of recognition that brings him to himself, his real self, as he comes into a union with God. Because then Jesus says to him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. Now I am going to tell you who you are. You really are." This is taken from the Message translation. "You are Peter, my rock. This is the rock on which I will put together my church, a church so expansive with energy that not even the gates of hell will be able to keep it out. And that's not all. You will have complete and free access to God's kingdom, keys to open any and every door. No more barriers between heaven and earth, earth and heaven." The way Peter answered Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" brought him into a new relationship with God that fundamentally changed who he was and how he would look at everything thereafter. And that brings us back to the question of miracles. If in your heart you believe that Jesus was the Son of God, then you have no problem believing that he could make miracles happen. After all, the God of all creation has the power to do whatever he wills with the universe that he has brought into existence, and which itself, when you think about it, is utterly miraculous in its beauty and its mystery and its splendor. But if you don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God, then you probably won't believe that the miracles that the Bible records are anything more than myths or, at best, symbols. Certainly not something that can be literally, not just figuratively, believed. So it all comes down to Jesus' question, "Who do you say that I am?" And everything depends on our answer to that question. So let's see how artists dealt with some of these very same episodes from the Bible that we've talked about. We'll begin with the miracles. Early on, the Lombard brothers, as you now are familiar, created a wonderful book of hours for the Duke of Berry in what is now France. And they were illuminators from the north, miniaturists. And this is an absolutely exquisite example of their work with the wonderful columbines and the little snail shells around it, with Jesus blessing the loaves and the fishes in the middle, with this exquisite sky so beautifully kind of paisley patterned, absolutely refined, perfect, utterly unlike what it probably really looked like, but beautiful and fit for a duke. Moving on to a painter from the Netherlands, Lombard Lomba, well known in Antwerp, more known for the influence he had on other painters, but this is considered one of his most important works. And you have Jesus emphasized in the middle by these vertical lines of the rock formations. Jesus here blessing the loaves and fish that his disciples are holding out for him, and we'll move in a little bit on him. As you can see, there are the loaves and the fishes being blessed. And if you look, the feet are wonderfully foreshortened here. And there seems to be, if you look around amongst all of these characters, as your eye moves across in a zigzag, you see that feet seem to come into prominence. And as I was studying this image, I was drawn to this woman in the forefront with the baby, and I suddenly saw her feet. And if you look, I don't know if you can see them, but they're either tattooed or they have henna on them in a really elaborate pattern. Can you see that? There is no explanation in any art book that I've been able to find about women tattooing their feet, their naked feet, at that time or any other time in this culture. So if any of you can solve that mystery for me, I would really, really appreciate it. There you have a most unusual picture, and indeed, as is always true with the Northern School, your eye goes back to a wonderful landscape in the background with the aerial perspective that takes you from the warm colors to the slightly cooler till it fades out into the white. Now back to a more Byzantine presentation by Veneziano with the bright colors of Venice and the highly stylized waves, the draperies that are highlighted with gold, but very stiff. Peter being rescued as he sinks beneath the waves here. He's asked Jesus to call him to him, but he doesn't quite have the faith to make the entire journey. And all of the 12 disciples are squashed into the bark here as the winds blow them across the Sea of Galilee in the storm. This is at the other end of the spectrum from a Byzantine kind of image, much more updated. A very well-known Russian artist by the name of Ivan Aivazovsky, who's very well known for his seascapes. He painted the sea in the manner of a Turner, if you will, very, very accurately. And the way he could render the water coming off of the paddle here, the sea waves and the foam, with Peter coming toward Christ, is the most realistic and at the same time spiritual vision that I've seen of this miracle. And artists tend to shy away from this miracle. It's very hard for them to envision it and present it in a credible way, but I think he has succeeded. Back again to Siena and a more Byzantine presentation by Duccio. You remember the altarpiece that was such a tour de force. Nobody had seen people treated this realistically as they were in these small predels, and we're going to take a look at this one. This is Jesus healing the blind man with all of the disciples grouped behind him eagerly. The blind man is here having the saliva and mud applied to his eyes, and he's turning around. He's been healed. He's throwing the cane that he's had all his life away as he gains his sight. And you see a wonderful version of early perspective, which was such a revolution at that time and drew people to Siena to see this miracle of spatial treatment that was so novel. El Greco came to Italy to learn about perspective. He came from Crete. He was an icon painter very much in the Byzantine tradition. And he begins learning there how to manipulate perspective with these receding lines of the tiles to a vanishing point that's almost in the center of the picture. He has just a partial grasp of how to manipulate it, because these people are a little too big for the distance at which they're represented as being. Christ here on the left, healing the blind man with a lot of cloud agitation over here, a very agitated group on the right-hand side, a calm group on the left. El Greco returns to this theme that he didn't handle very well, and he begins to improve on it. He takes the vanishing point further off and to the right, which makes it a little more interesting. But he's still having a problem with these figures. They've now gone too far into the background and are too small for the space that they're occupying. And he's supplanted the man that had been there, as you can see, with a different figure, which is now much more characteristic of the El Greco that you're probably familiar with those long kind of flaming bodies, spiritualized. And in fact, he eventually gives up trying to master perspective, which he just couldn't wrap his mind around, and it obviously wasn't terribly important to him. But it's interesting to see a great artist trying to master a technique, and it makes any of us who have tried to learn how to paint feel a little bit better that the great masters had some problems with it as well. I think he also has created a problem for himself by supplanting the dogs with these humans who appear to be now in a hole. There's no intelligent way to explain what they're doing. So that he's just decided to place them there as a bit of relief. This brings us to one of the most famous of Rembrandt's works, the 100 Guilder print, so called because there's a story that it was purchased back by Rembrandt for 100 guilders, quite a large sum at that time, because he wanted one of the few prints that was circulating to be in his possession. Many of the techniques that Rembrandt used are represented here, from this dark, tenebrous background, very soft lines, to very sketchy lines over here. He began using Japanese paper at this time that takes an impression very beautifully. It doesn't wear away the surface of the metal as quickly, so you can get many more impressions. We'll look a little more closely. There's Jesus healing some of the people and preaching at the same time. People have been brought on their litters, elderly folks. Here's a woman with her baby. That's the baby's head, and you can see the feet here. So the children are coming to him. So a number of the stories of Jesus are encompassed in this single one. We'll take a look at this group. This person is in a litter, obviously. This is an elderly man bent over on his stick, being helped by the hand with a person who's bringing him to Jesus, and a host of other people who are there to hear or to be healed. The group on the left, much sketchier. As you can see, the lines are cleaner. And we have down here the rich young ruler who could not decide if he was going to leave all of his possessions and follow Jesus when Jesus challenged him to do so. He went away sorrowful because he was so wealthy, so we're left suspended. And the Pharisees are up here discussing what Jesus is teaching, debating whether it's right for him to be teaching, and certainly he shouldn't be healing on the Sabbath. This is another look at them, with the rich young ruler pausing here, and all the Pharisees debating. Over here on the right-hand side, amusingly enough, is a camel. And Rembrandt puts the camel there to remind us that it's easier for a camel to pass through an eye of a needle than it is for the rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's amusingly brought the two together. It's a small print, but exquisitely done with all of these details. And now we come to Peter's confession of faith, which in the Catholic Church becomes an event of great importance and political interpretation. Pope Sixtus IV, after whom the Sistine Chapel is named, Sixtus becomes Sistine, had a program of art that he wanted done to fresco the walls. And as you remember from previous times, on one wall will be the events in Jesus' life that face the key events in Moses' life. So here we have Jesus handing the keys of the kingdom to Peter, front and center. You can see how important it is because the single perspective vanishing point, very beautifully done by Perugino, is also the same line on which the key falls. And the key is critically important to establish that the apostolic succession passes through Peter to his successors in Rome, that the papacy is secured the minute Peter gets these keys. And it is the antitype of the other wall where Moses is first of all seen over here. They're attempting to stone him. Here he is, and Joshua is preventing people from stoning him. This is Aaron up here with his triple tiara crown, which is the very one that the Pope wears, and as I'll show you in a moment. This is Moses banishing a number of the other priests who tried to supplant Aaron. They have their censers, if you can see them. And here is Aaron's censer. They tried to present the incense, saying they were just as worthy as Aaron was to act as priests. Well, that didn't work out too well, and they were being swallowed up by the earth over here. Point being that let no man take the honor to himself except he that is called by God as Aaron was. That's the legend up here. So then you come across again, there's the papal helmet or crown, just as Aaron wore. You come back to the antitype, which is affirming the authority of Peter to rule over Christ's temporal kingdom. A number of events are happening here in the background. We'll take a look. On the right here in the background, there's an attempt to stone Jesus, as is biblically the case, but he walks right through it, if you remember. Moses had a little more trouble walking right through it. He had to be protected, as you remember, by Joshua. But here, Jesus is walking right through it. Here's Peter. This is John, the beloved disciple. This is Perugino himself, the artist. A little cameo. We'll take a closer look at John. It's a very beautiful portrait, very exquisite. The temple in the middle, based on the Dome of the Rock, which was thought to be the continuation of Solomon's tomb. So this is in Rome, but it's to evoke that same kind of apostolic authority as the Temple of Solomon. And you have these wonderful triumphal arches on either side. Here you have the tribute money, Jesus rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's and telling them to render unto God what is God's. But you have another wonderful arch, and they're both reminiscent of Constantine's arch in Rome. Constantine was, as you probably remember, the first emperor to recognize Christianity as an official religion of state. And he also was thought to be the first to recognize papal succession, papal authority. So you have all of these symbols in Perugino's work to remind you, as a visitor to the Sistine Chapel, that Peter is the first pope of a whole line of popes. And artistically speaking, this is interesting because you can see that Perugino has spared himself some work in this fresco by doubling up figures. This figure is the same as this figure. This man with his hands on his hips is the same as this man. This figure here echoes this figure here as well as the figure of Christ. This figure here echoes this figure. So that when he's outlining with a pierced cartoon, the walls, he simply uses the same cartoons, these large paper figures, to make the figures that populate his fresco. So he's saving himself a little time and energy. But a very political statement here. Coming to the Transfiguration of Jesus, back to Duccio's Maestà, the Virgin in Majesty, down at the bottom. We're going to take a look again at a rather Byzantine picture of Jesus with the same very stiff folds, the three disciples at the bottom with Moses and Elijah conferring with Christ on the mountain. Coming forward in time, Fra Angelico in San Marco in Florence. This is in cell number 6, if you ever happen to get to San Marco. And you can enter the cell and see this. One monk would be there, and he would be meditating on this small image of Christ being transfigured. This is Moses, recognizable by his little horns. If you remember the mistranslation we talked about last year that was propagated by the Vulgate translation, that Moses was cornu, that he was horned rather than radiant. That gets fixed later, but for the time being, he then developed horns as his attribute. This is Elijah over here, and unusually, we have a figure of the Virgin Mary and Saint Dominic, who was the head of the order of Dominicans who housed San Marco. The geometrical form around Christ is called a mandorla. It symbolizes his aura of holiness. It has a special name, and you'll see it frequently when Christ is depicted. Moving in on him, you can see how his eyes have been made very, very piercing. So the monk who looks at him day by day is going to be focusing on those wonderful eyes. The next two images are by Giovanni Bellini. This comes from the beginning of his career when he was still very much under the influence of his brother-in-law, Andrea Mantegna, who loved to create a very stony, almost petrified kind of atmosphere. He was very fond of perspective, but you can see almost an archaeological interest in the stone. The sky doesn't look particularly transparent, and that's very typical of Mantegna, who had this influence on Bellini. Bellini comes into his own 32 years later with this much more airy and spacious vision of the Transfiguration. He takes Jesus off of the mountain, and I'll put the two images together for you. This is so vertical and so stony, and this is much more luminous, much more naturalistic. You see the light going from right to the dark left, symbolic. You have the tree of life here, and you have a dead stump here, a dead tree here, the light being generated on this side, darkness here, telling that Christ is bringing new light, a new covenant, but a very, very different vision from the one on the left. Perugino, who did the Confession of Peter a little bit earlier in the same very refined, almost precious technique, having Jesus in his mandorla up here, the disciples with their Latin legend down here, Lord, it is good for us to be here, and above, and you can barely see it going across here, is God saying, this is my son in whom I am well pleased, with Moses and Elijah beside Christ. A very mannered kind of presentation. Perugino was the master of Raphael, his most famous pupil and one of the greats of the Renaissance. Raphael began his painting career painting just like this, in this very refined, almost precious way. But his version, the last picture he worked on, a great, enormous fresco, the work of his life, is this Transfiguration. He did this in competition with Michelangelo, and we'll talk about that next time when we meet. But you have two things going on. You have Jesus up above in this very blue, serene environment, ascending almost. It's a posture almost like the Ascension and also reminiscent of the cross, with Moses and Elijah and the disciples here. But down below, you have much warmer colors, confusing colors, and all kinds of mayhem breaking out. There is a young man here who is demon-possessed. This is the episode that directly follows the Transfiguration, when the disciples come with other people saying, we were unable to heal this demoniac. So there's absolute pandemonium below, and Raphael captures that in the twisted forms of the bodies, which would have been impossible without the work of Michelangelo. These are some of the images from the Sistine Chapel with these turning, twisting bodies and these brilliant colors, none of which Raphael used until he saw Michelangelo's work, because they were working at the same time in Rome, and that directly affected his own work. We're going to move in a little more closely to see Christ in his ascension and crucifixion posture with wonderful drapery. He worked on it for several years before his death in 1520. We'll move in to see these two figures exquisitely drawn with these beautifully foreshortened hands of Peter, this gesture to the chest. Excuse me, that's not Peter, it's just an elderly man. Peter's up above. But just beautifully, beautifully rendered. And then this wizened old man who is just a character that you have to love. Exquisitely rendered in very small compass, just the brown and the white, to create an image that's pretty unforgettable of this gentleman. And then the man on his right, the disciple who's gesturing out, directing our eyes, is beautifully done as well. So Raphael spent an extraordinary amount of time preparing for this. Down in the lower left, you see again the hand gestures that he wanted to emphasize and that he renders so beautifully here. He also renders the bodies nude because he wanted to capture the musculature and the bone structure underneath and then clothe it. He was very thorough in the same way that Michelangelo and Leonardo were. So he clothes him with beautifully rendered drapery. So that is one of the most powerful images that Raphael ever created, and it's a worthy subject. The Transfiguration above, the world of the demons below. It's a contrast almost of the Apollinian and the Dionysian, as Nietzsche once said when he described this. As opposed to what was going on in the northern countries at this time. The very same year that Raphael was finishing a work that was teeming with energy and color, you get a very refined, very restrained palette, very little movement, a beautiful landscape scene with the kind of aerial perspective we've seen, but so controlled and measured. And this is what's going to be the case in the northern countries, where the Reformation is spreading at this time, and all of the imagery in the church is going to be removed or given a very strict diet. So images don't progress too much in the northern countries, and they take a totally different path in the south. With the Counter-Reformation that emphasized individual faith with the Ignatian spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. So you were encouraged to imagine these amazing scenes, and the more dramatic, the better. So Veronese gives you a kind of technicolor transformation of Christ, transfiguration with the disciples hidden in a cloud below. And then, even more explosively, Titian, a Cecil B. DeMille kind of explosion of light as the disciples are almost thrown backward by the energy of it. And Moses holds up his commandments. Elijah bows before Christ. And finally, Ludovico Carracci, with the same kind of energy, devotion, really a manneristic approach, and this will lead right into mannerism. So that brings us to a conclusion for now. This is your assignment for the next time, and remember that we'll meet on March 10th. Thank you.